She had decided, somewhere between the second coaching in and the third, that she would not cry again until it was over. It was a practical decision, the kind her mother would have approved of. Her mother, who had taught her that a woman with good posture and a calm expression could walk into almost any room and be underestimated just long enough to be useful. Imogen Ashford had good posture. She had a calm expression, and she had, tucked into the lining of her traveling bag, a letter from Mr. Crewe, her late father's solicitor, informing her that she had approximately 14 days before the estate passed permanently and legally out of her reach. 14 days. She looked out the window of the coach as it turned off the main road, and there it was. Thornfield Park, rising out of the gray morning the way it always had, certain of itself, unhurried, as though it had never once considered that it might belong to anyone else. She had grown up in those rooms. She knew where the floorboards creaked and which window in the east wing let in the rain and the exact smell of the library on a cold afternoon when the fire had just been lit. She knew all of it, the way you know a thing you never thought to question. She watched it through the coach glass and kept her face still. The plan was simple, in the way that only desperate plans are simple. She had written to the housekeeper, a Mrs. Paget, requesting a position, not as herself, but as Miss Hale, a lady's companion recently arrived from Halifax. With references she had written herself on paper, she had aged carefully with cold tea. She was not proud of the references, but she was not, at this particular moment, in a position to be proud of very much. The coach stopped at the servants' entrance as she had requested. That was the first thing. If she arrived at the front, someone might remember her. It had been 3 years, but 3 years was not long enough. She stepped down onto the gravel, carrying her own bag, and looked at the door she had never once in her childhood been required to use. Right, she thought. In we go. Mrs. Paget was a small woman with the precise, measuring gaze of someone who had spent 30 years deciding, within the first 15 seconds of meeting a person, exactly how much trouble they were likely to be. She looked at Imogen in the stone-flagged corridor outside the kitchen and said nothing for a long moment. "Your references are in order," she said at last, which Imogen suspected was Mrs. Paget's version of a warm welcome. "Thank you, Mrs. Paget. His Grace arrives from London this afternoon. He keeps the house on a close schedule. You'll be attending Miss Wentworth. She arrived from Bath last week and has already managed to offend 2 of the upstairs maids and break a looking-glass." She paused. Whether the looking-glass was accidental is unclear. Imogen thought it was probably best not to ask about Miss Wentworth just yet. "You'll take your meals in the servants' hall. Your room is in the east wing." Mrs. Paget turned away, then stopped. "Oh, and there are a pair of riding boots in the front hall that came in from the stables this morning. See that they're cleaned and left outside his lordship's dressing room before 4 o'clock. She was gone before Imogen could respond. Imogen stood alone in the corridor for a moment, her bag at her feet, the smell of the house settling around her like something half-remembered. There was the lemon oil they used on the paneling. She had always loved that smell. There was the particular quality of the cold, the way it came up from the flagstones and wrapped around your ankles. There was the faint, distant sound of the clock. In the front hall, the one her father had wound himself every Sunday morning without fail. She picked up her bag and went to find the boots. They were worse than she had imagined. She stood in the front hall. Her front hall, with its portraits and its marble floor, and the vase of late-season dahlias, someone had placed on the side table, just as her mother always had, and looked down at a pair of riding boots that appeared to have been walked through the better part of a horse paddock, possibly more than once. The Duke of Ravenmore had large feet. She made a note of this, filed it nowhere useful, and carried the boots to the kitchen. She was halfway through the first boot when she heard him. She did not see him come in. She was concentrating on the brush and the particular intractability of dried mud, and what she heard first was his voice in the corridor. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never in its life had cause to raise itself, because the people around it had already stopped what they were doing to listen. He was speaking to Mr. Tate, the steward, about the repairs on the east boundary wall, and he spoke the way a man speaks about a thing that is unambiguously his, without drama, with only the faint authority of ownership. She kept her head down. He passed the doorway without looking in. She heard his boots on the stairs, clean boots, presumably, since she was holding the others, and then nothing. She finished the left boot, then the right. She set them outside his dressing room door at 3:20, which she was privately rather pleased about. Miss Louisa Wentworth was 22, possessed of extraordinary cheekbones, and the conversational habits of someone who had never been disagreed with in a way that stuck. She was in Thornfield Park because she was in Thornfield Park, which was apparently sufficient explanation for her presence. That, and the pointed interest of the Dowager Countess of Ravenmore, who had been corresponding with Louisa's mother for the better part of 2 seasons. In private, Miss Wentworth had a way of looking at the household staff that suggested she had not yet fully decided whether they were people. It was not malice, exactly. It was something that had never been corrected and had therefore grown into something worse than malice. Indifference. She spoke to Imogen with the brisk efficiency of someone issuing instructions to a piece of furniture, and it was in this that she revealed herself most completely. Not what she said, but the fact that she never once appeared to consider that the furniture might have opinions. Imogen had opinions. She kept them where they were most useful, which was entirely to herself. "You're very quiet," Miss Wentworth said on the 3rd morning, while Imogen was arranging her hair. She said it the way one notes a mildly unusual feature of the landscape. "It is an advantage in a companion, I've been told," Imogen said. "I suppose." Miss Wentworth turned her head a fraction, examining her own reflection. "Do you know much about the Duke?" "No more than anyone, Miss Wentworth. He inherited 3 years ago. There was apparently a whole terrible business. The previous owner died, and there were debts and some sort of legal complication about the entail. No one seems to want to discuss it in detail." She said this in the particular tone of someone for whom other people's tragedies are primarily interesting for their social inconvenience. In any case, he's been making improvements. "The East Wing has been entirely remodeled." She paused. "Which I think is rather a shame. Old houses ought to look old, don't you think?" Imogen looked at the East Wing through the bedroom window. The East Wing where she had been given her room. The East Wing where she had, at the age of 7, hidden a stray cat for 6 weeks in the room behind the water closet, and had been found out only when the cat produced 4 kittens and a great deal of noise in the middle of a dinner party. "I imagine," she said, "it depends on the house." She had not expected to see so much of him. She had expected the Duke of Ravenmore to be a figure glimpsed at a distance. At meals she was not invited to attend. In hallways she was already leaving. But Thornfield Park was not, it turned out, the kind of house where people stayed in their appointed sections. He walked. He walked at odd hours through all parts of the house, in the way of a man who was still in the process of taking possession of something and had not yet found all its edges. She turned a corner in the library gallery on her 4th day and nearly walked directly into him. He had a book. She had a letter, her 3rd attempt at writing to Mr. Crewe, the solicitor, who held the only copies of her father's original will. She pulled up short. He did the same. Up close, he was younger than she had been expecting from his voice. Or perhaps not younger but less finished, the way men sometimes are when their authority is recently acquired rather than inherited from infancy. There were lines around his eyes that were not quite settled. He looked at her with the slight frown of someone placing a face they do not quite recognize. "You must be the new companion," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss Hale." He nodded, the way one nods to a piece of information that has been received and set aside. He was already looking back at his book. Then he stopped. "Are you interested in land law?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You were looking at that shelf." He nodded at the row of books to her left. She had not been, in fact, consciously looking at anything, but she became aware now that the shelf contained 3 volumes she recognized from her father's study, including a specific treatise on the laws of inheritance that she had once read in its entirety, out of pure necessity, sitting on the floor with a cold cup of tea and the growing certainty that everything her family had built was about to be unmade. "Not particularly," she said. "I was simply passing through." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he went back to his book. She left the gallery at a pace that was not, she was quite sure, suspicious in any way. The days had a shape she had not anticipated. Useful. She had thought it would be difficult, being here. She had thought the house would press on her, the accumulation of familiar things in unfamiliar arrangements. Her mother's escritoire moved to the blue sitting room. The portrait of her grandfather relocated to a hallway where it hung slightly too high. Some things were the same. The window seat in the morning room still caught the afternoon sun precisely as it always had, and it was in this window seat on the 8th day that she found herself almost happy, which was when things became complicated. She had been reading an actual book, not anything useful, just a novel, when he came in. He apologized for the interruption. She began to rise. "Please don't," he said. "I only came for the morning's post." He gathered it from the table, started to leave, then didn't. "You're from Halifax, Mrs. Paget tells me." "Yes, Your Grace." He sat down in the chair across from her, the chair that had been her father's, though he could not have known that. "I grew up in Halifax briefly. My mother's family." What part? And here it was, the first real difficulty. She had chosen Halifax because it was far enough away, and she had once spent a winter there at the age of 11, visiting her aunt. She knew enough to be plausible, but she had not expected to be questioned by someone who had also been there, who might know the streets, who might name a family she was supposed to have belonged to. "The North End," she said. "We were not a prominent family." "No," he said. He was looking at her with that unsettled expression again, the one she could not quite read. "I don't suppose I would have known you then." "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose you would have." He left. She put her book down and sat very still for a while, looking at the afternoon sun on the window seat, and thought about the 14 days that had become 8. She found the irregularity on the 9th day, by accident. She had gone to the library to return the book she had finished. She left it on the returns shelf, which was a system Mrs. Paget ran with something approaching religious devotion. And she noticed, because she noticed things, that the 3rd drawer of the writing desk in the corner was not quite closed. The writing desk where, if she was remembering correctly, the household records were kept. And the household records, if her father's system had been maintained, would include the original correspondence with his solicitor from the year of the disputed inheritance. She did not open the drawer. She thought about opening the drawer. She went to bed and lay awake listening to the clock in the front hall and thought about it some more. On the 10th day, she opened the drawer. The correspondence was there. All of it, the letters her father had written and the replies he had received, and, at the very bottom, a document she had not known existed, a secondary codicil to the will, dated 6 weeks before her father's death, in his handwriting witnessed and notarized. She stood at the writing desk with the thing in her hands and read it twice, and then stood there a while longer, not quite able to make her thoughts move forward. The codicil changed everything. It named her directly, by name, not merely as a dependent of the estate, but as the designated heir in her own right, which was unusual, and which her father had apparently gone to some trouble to make legal, and which had never, she was quite certain, been entered into evidence with the solicitors because she had never been told it existed. Her hands were not entirely steady when she folded it back up. She had 8 days. No, 4. She had 4 days before Mr. Crewe's window closed. She nearly walked into him again. It seemed to be something she was developing a habit of. This time it was the corridor outside the library, and this time he was not alone. Miss Wentworth was beside him, her hand on his arm, saying something that required her to lean rather close, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is being charming because it is required of him, and would prefer to be doing something else. He looked up when Imogen appeared around the corner, and for just a moment his expression changed. She could not have said how, exactly, only that it became something less managed. "Miss Hale," he said. "Good evening, Your Grace, Miss Wentworth." She kept walking. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard Miss Wentworth say something low and laughing. She heard him say nothing. She went to her room in the east wing. Her room, which had been a guest room in her father's time, which smelled faintly of the roses that had grown outside the window for as long as she could remember, and sat on the edge of the bed and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She had a codicil. She had Mr. Crewe's address. What she did not have was a reliable way of getting to him, and back within 4 days, without Mrs. Paget noticing she was gone, or without. There was a knock at her door. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and opened it. He was standing in the corridor, still in his dinner clothes, without Miss Wentworth. He looked, for the first time since she had arrived, uncertain. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "The boots," he said. "On your first day. It was not, that is to say, I did not give the instruction, but I was aware of it, and I should have countermanded it. It was not the appropriate task for a lady's companion." He paused. "I am told you did them without complaint." "They were boots, Your Grace. They required cleaning." He looked at her. That look again. The one she could not read, the one that felt like someone reaching toward a conclusion they had not quite arrived at. "Where did you work before Lafax?" he asked. She had prepared for this question. She had an answer. But the answer did not come because she was tired, genuinely, bone-tired, in a way that had accumulated across 10 days of being someone else in her own house. And she said, without meaning to, "I would rather not discuss it, if you don't mind." He was quiet for a moment. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me," and he left. She closed the door and put her back against it and stood there until her heart stopped doing whatever it was doing. She wrote to Mr. Crewe that night. She sealed the letter before she could change her mind and gave it to the stable boy in the morning with a coin and instructions to post it in the village. Then she went about her day, Miss Wentworth's Heir, Miss Wentworth's correspondence, a walk in the east garden where the dahlias had gone past their best, and tried not to count the hours. He found her in the garden. She did not know that he had seen her speaking to the stable boy. She did not know that he had recognized her handwriting on the letter. He had not then. Or that he had been watching the east garden because it was the only window from his study that did not base the drive and the ongoing disruption of the repair works. She did not know any of this until much later. What she knew, in the moment, was that he sat down on the stone bench beside the sundial. The sundial that had been there since before she was born, that her father had showed her how to read on a summer afternoon when she was very small, and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "You know this garden." She looked at the sundial. She looked at her hands. "Most gardens are much the same." "No," he said. "They are not." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the rose beds, the ones that had been laid out in a pattern she had drawn herself at 12 years old, in a sketchbook she had given her father for Christmas. I have been trying to understand this garden for 3 years. The planting scheme makes no obvious sense, not ornamental, not kitchen, not to any pattern I have found in any book of estate management, and yet someone planted it with a great deal of intention. He paused. Someone who knew what they were doing, and who was also, I think, perhaps 12 years old. She said nothing. I found the sketchbook, he said, in the estate records, with your name in it. The air in the garden seemed to become very still. Imogen Ashford, he said. He said it quietly, not like an accusation. Not Hale. She looked at him then. There was no point in not looking at him. Your Grace, how long have you been here? 10 days. He was quiet for a long time. Behind them somewhere a door opened and closed. The dahlias moved in the light wind off the hills. The codicil, he said at last. She stared at him. You knew about it. I found it 2 weeks ago. In the same drawer where you found it, I'd imagine. He looked at her properly now. I have been trying to locate you. My solicitors had no current address. Your father's solicitor, Mr. Crewe. I had written to him. He had not replied. He paused. I imagine he was waiting to hear from you first. She could not quite make sense of what he was telling her. Her mind kept arriving at the shape of it and sliding off. You were trying to find me. The estate is yours, he said simply. That was not a complicated conclusion to reach once I had the document. He looked at the rose beds again, the ones she had planted in a pattern that no book of estate management would recognize because it was not from any book. It was from memory, from the way she had thought, at 12, that a garden ought to feel, which was not orderly but alive. It was the garden that made me certain. No one plants a garden like this for a house they are merely visiting. She found she had nothing to say. This was unusual. She was not generally a person who ran out of things to say. I will write to Crewe tomorrow, he said, and to my own solicitor. The documentation is in order. It is simply a matter of entering it formally. He stood. I am sorry for the boots, Miss Ashford. I am sorry for the boots and for a great many other things you were subjected to in a house that was already, by right, your own. She looked up at him. You could have pretended not to know, she said. The entail would have continued. Yes, he said, the estate is valuable. Yes, and I am no one. I am a woman who arrived at the servant's entrance with a forged reference and cleaned your boots. He looked at her with the expression she had not been able to read and now, at last, was beginning to. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision some time ago and had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for the moment to say so out loud. You planted a garden at the age of 12, he said. That made you miss, every spring, a house you had lost. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the furthest possible thing from nothing. It took 3 weeks for the legal matter to be settled. She was not at Thornfield Park for those 3 weeks, Mrs. Paget had been deeply unsettled by the revelation, and there had been a series of conversations that Imogen could only describe as requiring considerable management on everyone's part. She stayed at the village inn, which had small rooms and excellent soup, and received daily correspondence from Mr. Crewe, who turned out to be an old man with a great deal of suppressed anxiety about the whole affair, and was clearly relieved to be done with it. She received also correspondence from the Duke of Ravenmore. His letters were brief. He wrote about the east boundary wall, which was now repaired. He wrote about the library, and asked whether she had a preference regarding the arrangement of the shelves, as the current system, which was his own, was possibly not the most intuitive. He wrote once about the window seat in the morning room, and the quality of the afternoon light there, and she read that particular letter 3 times on 3 separate occasions, which told her something she had not entirely decided what to do with yet. Miss Wentworth, she learned from Mrs. Paget, had departed for Bath the day after the garden conversation. She had sent no note. The solicitors wrote. The documents were signed. Mr. Crewe wrote one final letter. the most concise of all of them, which said simply that the estate of Thornfield Park was hers, that the matter was concluded, and that he hoped she would now be able to rest. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, and walked out of the village inn onto the high street, where the October light was doing something particular to the maples, that specific Canadian autumn gold, the color of late afternoons and things settling into their proper place, and she stood there for a moment and let it be over. She arrived at Thorn Park on a Thursday, through the front door. Mrs. Paget met her in the entrance hall, with a look that was approximately an apology and approximately something warmer. The dahlias were still on the side table. Someone, she suspected Mrs. Paget, had replaced the ones that had gone over. He was in the library. She had known he would be. She had known it the way you know a thing that has been quietly true for some time, waiting for you to stop being busy long enough to notice it. She knocked. He looked up from his book. "The solicitors tell me it is concluded," she said from the doorway. "So I understand." He stood. "I haven't yet decided," she said, "what to do about the guest quarters. You are, naturally, welcome to remain." "I was rather hoping," he said, "that you might do me the honor of reading my letter again. The one about the morning room." She had it in her pocket. She had had it in her pocket for 11 days. "I've read it," she said. "Several times, I hope." "3 times," she said, and then, because there did not seem to be any particular advantage in lying about it. "So far." He crossed the library toward her, and the afternoon came through the windows the way it always did in that room, steady, unhurried, certain of itself. And she thought of the sundial and the rose garden and the sketchbook with her name in it, and the way some things, given enough time, have a way of finding their way back. The house was hers, the garden was hers. The man standing in the doorway of her library, with his book still open in his hand and the afternoon light behind him, was looking at her the way people look at things they have already, very quietly, made their minds up about. And that, she thought, watching him, was its own kind of returning home.